The National Bureau of Statistics, in its latest report, says Nigeria's headline inflation rose to 22.04% on a year-on-year basis in March. The figure is 0.13% higher than what was recorded in February. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund (IMF) at its spring meetings, which ended over the weekend in Washington, D.C., United States, has advised central banks globally to maintain a tight monetary policy stance in order to manage rising inflation, a position that the Central Bank of Nigeria has maintained for a while now in the face of a continuous rise in inflationary pressure. Today on the program, we'll be speaking with a seasoned economist to examine the relevance of the IMF recommendation on taming inflation in relation to our domestic environment, as well as factors that can help grow the Nigerian economy. All after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Headline inflation trended slightly upwards in March, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. The Central Bank of Nigeria has over time maintained a tight monetary policy stance to tame inflation in the country, well ahead of the recent recommendation by the International Monetary Fund (IMF). And for analysis of current economic situation in the country, we spoke earlier with economist and chief consultant of B. Adedipe Associates Limited, Dr. Biodun Adedipe, for his views. Dr. Biodun Adedipe joins us from Atlanta, United States. Many thanks for joining us on the program this afternoon, sir.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Thank you too. Now, the International Monetary Fund (IMF) has recommended that central banks around the world maintain a tight monetary policy stance in their various jurisdictions. That was not the initial position of the IMF. Even though the CBN here in Nigeria has been doing that for the reason of taming inflation. Now, what has changed? Why did the IMF change its mind? Why recommending that CBN tightens? And to what extent should that recommendation be taken into account?
All right, thank you so very much. That, in fact, is the usual pattern with Bretton Woods institutions, that's the World Bank and IMF. They make recommendations based on their world view, what is happening globally. And of course, we all know quite well that at this very present moment, the major macroeconomic challenge facing all countries, or let me say most countries anyway, around the world is inflation. And since normalization began in 2022, early 2022, which we say in monetary policy terms is raising interest rates back to the normal level it was before the massive intervention to ensure the economy don't go into recession in 2020 and early 2021. Now, having seen that pattern, monetary policy to normal levels, that's why it's called normalization. So, and since that began, there has not been any major check on inflation. Inflationary pressures are still there all over the world. So, and that is why, in the light of expectation of a number of countries this year going into recession, as you know, forecast by IMF, that is why IMF came back to now recommend that, look, central banks should take tight monetary policy stance until they see inflation subside and put under check. Now, that is the general scenario. And the good thing about IMF and possibly the World Bank is that they only give an advice. So it is up to us, therefore, in Nigeria, to look at our own peculiar situation and now decide whether to go with that advice, or we make some modifications to it, or in fact, possibly go in the opposite direction. And that is what brings us back to our own situation in Nigeria, where we now look at the problem of inflation, with what IMF advised to deal with by maintaining tight monetary policy. Can it really be solved by tight monetary policy? Which means we now interrogate the nature of that inflation.
And that leads us to my next question, because latest statistics shows that inflation in Nigeria has now risen to 22.04%.
That's right.
When do you think that the tight monetary policy stance of the Central Bank of Nigeria to tame inflation will begin to take root? And what other tools would you suggest that the CBN deploys?
Very good question there. And I will put it in context of my personal experience. The first one happened in 1989. I was then a research economist with the World Bank office in Nigeria. And I was mandated to lead a study of inflation in Nigeria. Interestingly, the report that we wrote that went to Washington was in April 1989, which makes it precisely 34 years ago, as we are speaking. And the conclusion I drew as the leader of the team that did the study was that if there was no intervention, the kind of inflationary pressure we're seeing and the trouble it was causing Nigeria would likely result in social, disturbances, which unfortunately happened 2 months after. But that became a reference then in the World Bank that it had never happened that we do an interpretation of what is happening and make a forecast that was likely to cause social troubles, and it will happen almost like 2 months after. Okay, so which in my own understanding is possibly that experience is what informed the intervention by the World Bank in terms of the palliative package that they gave to the Nigerian government recently. Now, that's on the one side. Then another one happened, this was within the context of Central Bank of Nigeria in November 2002. Okay, Central Bank used to do what we call the Annual Monetary Policy Conference. And I was a speaker at that event. And what the Central Bank wanted me to interrogate is which one should Central Bank emphasize between the three macro prices, and that is inflation rate, exchange rate, and interest rate. And I remember in my presentation, I made a very strong point that the major driver of inflation rates and every other thing happening in the economy happens to be the exchange value of the naira. In which case, Central Bank should pay more attention to ensuring that we have a strong naira. So we looked at the various issues in that. Okay, so if you now come to today, and that's why I made reference to those two instances. If we look at today, the inflation that we are dealing with in Nigeria is largely cost push. So we then ask ourselves, what are the elements that are in the cost push inflation we are facing today? And that is why, in my own opinion, the monetary policy rate is not sufficient as a tool to check the inflation we are dealing with today in Nigeria. So, and then on the other side, we say this is an economy that is desperately in need of growth. So if you want growth, that means you need to make credit affordable. And I've been privileged to also play within that space when we're working on the financial sector strategy for year 2020 for the Central Bank of Nigeria. I led the credit market team, and that was the major focus. How do we democratize credit? The component of which is to make it affordable. That talks to interest rates. Okay? So in which case, in the situation we are, in fact, raising monetary policy rate, which you call a signal rate, makes banks also to tick up their own rates. And when banks tick up their rates, it will make borrowing more expensive. That goes into the cost of doing business, on the one hand. Then, if you look at that vis-a-vis the high premium between the official and parallel market rates of exchange, again, you see there another element that is pushing costs as well. Okay, so ultimately then, you are looking at a situation where we have challenges in Greek, and the Central Bank for me has done very fantastically well in that area in terms of intervention. I'm all for what they did, but of course we know there are always challenges when it comes to implementation. Okay, but the intervention Central Bank did in the agri space, again, rely on data. And that is one of the things I appreciate about the Central Bank of today. A lot of the things they do are driven by data. If data shows that the bulk of your import of food items is rice, it's a pointer that that is the space within which you want to intervene. Quite all right. And Central Bank has done that very well. So in which case, Central bank at this instance needs to go to what we call the unorthodox tools. Okay, the orthodox tools are those that we know central bank use all over the world. The unorthodox will be the kind of intervention that, I made reference to now. And I'm one of those also who aligns with central bank that, look, if you want to import anything that is frivolous, and for close to 40 years, I've been making the argument that Nigeria has no business importing some basics that we can produce locally. And my typical examples are walking stick, toothpick, and of course, I think there's a third item I also use. So quick means then that you cannot open your economy for anything whatsoever to be imported. We are not saying ban importation, okay? And I was a part of a conversation in 1987, all right? We don't subscribe to ban importation of any item. But if you want official dollar, it will be for items that can be produced locally, all right? So which is why I believe that such tools which are not orthodox are what CBN should actually use in dealing with the challenges we are facing. But of course, there's also the issue of security anyway that is affecting domestic cultivation of food items. That also is a major challenge. We can now also ask ourselves, are there any ways that CBN can also intervene within that space? All right? Which if they do, that also will be unorthodox. But it simply means that since central bank will be providing support in strengthening security that can have a back positive effect of producing, or let me say agri-produce locally. But that also features in the inflation we see today. So all of these are areas that I believe central bank can also look into and see how they can further intervene in an unorthodox way.
All right, thank you very much. Now, away from inflation. Now, the dollar keeps rising, getting stronger. Nigeria keeps borrowing and debt servicing keeps rising, taking a toll on the economy. Some economists have advised or suggested that the CBN should stop lending to the federal government, even though the CBN is a lender of last resort to the government. How dire is Nigeria's economic situation? And will a change of button on May 29th make any difference?
Well, certainly a change of button will make a difference. And that again comes from the historical perspective. Once a new man comes into office, typically his team or her team, as the case may be, will do an evaluation of the situation the country is, on the one hand, look at the policies. And then, of course, there are 3 P's there, actually. You have policies, you have programs, and then you have projects. So quickly, we have to review and then ask themselves, which of these can we continue with that we can say is in the right direction in dealing with the challenges faced by our social, economic, and political life? Then, which ones do we need to ditch and replace? Or which ones should we even retain and tinker? Those are 3 perspectives to it. The ones to drop completely, the ones to retain, and the ones to retain and tinker. All right? So I expect there will be some changes, quite all right. But this particular issue of the role of central bank as the lender of last resort, yes, it's something we all learned in basic economics. But the reality, which of course came from experience, is that anytime the government borrows, especially through the window of central bank, we call it hot money in economics. Hot money in the sense that it is the kind of money that can trigger inflationary pressures. So the typical advice is that the recourse to that window by the government should be limited. All right? But we now ask ourselves, what are the alternatives? I'm not among those professional economists that will say Nigeria should not borrow. I've looked at countries all around the world. The key question is, what are we borrowing for? If borrowing is to develop and deliver infrastructure, either new one or renewal of the existing ones, I'm all for it. Because infrastructure, any day, anywhere, is an enabler. Okay? So the issue facing the new administration will be 2 things with respect to this. What do we do with the existing stock of debt, on the one hand? And then what do we do? If those are the two major questions they need to provide answers to. So if you ask me, I will recommend that they should stop forthwith borrowing from that window, okay, and look at other sources where they can borrow from, and also make a deliberate attempt to ensure that borrowing is directed more at projects, especially infrastructure. And of course, government also, as we see all around the world, can never have enough resources to deliver infrastructure. So what we now also advise is that it is more viable and yields better returns if government allows their private partners to handle the project that ordinarily they would have borrowed money from. Okay, that's what we call the PPP model, public-private partnership. Now, if they concession those projects to their private partners, those are the ones that will actually borrow. And because they are the ones borrowing, they will ensure that the outcome of that borrowing is effective and efficient so that they can pay back. So we deliver infrastructure quite all right. And at the same time, the body is not on the government in terms of borrowing and all the obligations relating to that.
All right, thank you. You have taken care of my next question in part, because I was about to ask that you should suggest some homegrown solutions, because I know from the seminar, a seminar that you gave that I attended, that you're an advocate of homegrown solutions to homegrown problems. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what I took away from that seminar. Now, I was about asking that you suggest homegrown solutions that can put Nigeria on the path of economic recovery, economic stability, and economic growth. Is there anything you'd like to add apart from what you have said earlier?
All right, thank you so very much. I think a similar question I encountered in an interview like this on October 1st, 1999. That was the first independence anniversary of then President Obasanjo in office as civilian president. Okay? And I was asked the question, what will you suggest to the president to do after all these conversations we have had? I said, look, there are peculiarities about Nigerians. We are hardworking people. We are also entrepreneurial. And I said, one major thing that has been holding our economy back is power. That if we get power right, and that still remains today, if we get power right, the economy of Nigeria will be unleashed. In fact, we see ourselves producing, we can generate a GDP that is 2-3 times the value we are looking at today, which means power is central to the Nigerian economy growing strongly and also inclusively. When we talk about inclusive growth, it means you are looking more at the bottom of the pyramid, where we have over 90% of registered businesses in Nigeria. And of course, millions of unregistered businesses are in that particular category. So one major constraint they face is power. So we need therefore to have a very clear road, map in terms of how do we ensure that 17,000 megawatts that Nigeria has capacity to generate today, we get ourselves into a position to transmit that. Because that's where the problem is. Today we transmit maximum 4,000 megawatts, maybe a little over. So that means there's a whole lot in terms of stranded power. Capacity on the ground, capacity that we can transmit, which is about 7,000. So if you look at 4, 7, 17, that means there's a whole lot in there. So what do we need to do therefore to ensure that we expand capacity to transmit and then also maintain generation close to the capacity we have installed? If we're able to do that, that will go a long way in getting this economy to grow inclusively. That's number one. Then number two is with respect to the exchange value of the Naira. I'm not in support of devaluation of the Naira, and for obvious reasons. If you interrogate the data, and happily we have data from 1960 to date, and of course, if you look at the data, clearly every occasion we devalue the Naira, we made every Nigerian poorer. Not only that, we make businesses smaller because we live in a global space now, where if I want to do business internationally, What they asked me to bring is bring your balance sheet. And they divide my Naira balance sheet by the exchange value of the Naira. And that gives a very tiny dollar amount. Okay? So now, given that it means once the Naira is devalued, the balance sheet of my company will shrink. Not because I'm not growing it Naira-wise, not because myself and my team are not working hard, but simply because of a policy stance. Unfortunately, and this crossed my mind this morning, okay, as I was thinking through this conversation we are going to have, and I said, if you look at Nigeria GDP, historically, every time we devalue the Naira, our GDP contracted. So as at the present moment, we are number 32. There's a time we moved to number 26, okay? We were aiming at number 20 by year 2020. But every time we devalue, it was like regression. So we start growing again. So the economy has been growing in Naira terms, by all means. But once we bring in the exchange value, it will shrink in comparison with other countries. So that creates a perception that the economy is not growing. It is not true. Okay? So but the question is, how do we deal with that? Dealing with that also takes us back to what I said earlier on, domestic production. So we need to deepen manufacturing in Nigeria. And I always recommend what China did. What China did simply revolved around three elements. And we have been also working on that in Nigeria. So this new government needs to intensify that. What China did was, number one, road infrastructure. Then number two, rail infrastructure. The third one was dry ports. Okay? So now the combination of those three enabled any manufacturer to set up his factory anywhere within the country. And the area, yes, we can give it to the outgoing government that they've done very well in terms of reviving our rail infrastructure. They've done well also in terms of road infrastructure. But the area we need to also look closely at are the dry ports. So, and for me, it's a matter of inviting those that this has been concession to. Now, ask them, what kind of help do you need from government to get your dry port running and operating? So when I saw a train come all the way from China to UK, I was on a short holiday in UK at the time, arrived in UK with manufactured goods. My mind went back to Nigeria. If a train can carry manufactures all the way from China to England, by all means, that means the investment in railway and roads that they began in 2004 and the commitment to inland container depots, which are dry ports, have actually paid off for China. So if we want to also do the same, we must look at those three in Nigeria so that factories can be sited everywhere, not just within the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway corridor or the Ogun State corridor. It needs to be throughout the nation. Okay, if we do that, we strengthen domestic manufacturing, and that by all means also reduce our dependence on imports. So the bill of 1.8 trillion per month that we had in 2022, we can actually reduce that significantly within the space of 4 years, continuing the administration.
Nigeria is a rich nation of green land, rich resources, countless crops and commodities sufficient to feed and provide a means of livelihood for her teeming population. Chin up, Nigeria, the giant of Africa. Exciting times are here. We can be self-reliant and grow our economy if we work together to explore our potential. It takes a whole nation. Let us get involved. Buy Nigerian to grow Nigeria.
We hope to bring you the concluding part of that interview with Dr. Biodun Adedipe in subsequent episode of the program. In the meantime, report unresolved banking issues to the CBN Consumer Protection Department using the email cpd@cbn.gov.ng. Attach relevant documents. Call the CBN contact center on the phone line +234 700 2255 226. Local call rates may apply. Write to us through the email address from the cbn@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter for updates and to watch uploaded episodes of the program. We invite you to join us again next time. I am Oluyemisi Dada. Barka de Sala. Stay safe. Bye for now.